Hey everybody, today is the last day of our book club where we are finishing up this book, The Secret of the Hidden Scrolls, Book 3, The Great Escape. So as a reminder, if you have gotten behind maybe on some of the chapters, we're on chapter 11 tonight. So if you need to go back and watch a different video first, then I encourage you to do that. We left off where Peter and Mary were visiting the house of Moses because the angel Michael told them that that would be a safe place for them to go. And we have seen Moses talk to the Pharaoh multiple times, asking him to let the Israelites, God's people, go, let them free from slavery. And every single time Pharaoh has said no, and every time Pharaoh has said no, God has sent something called a plague on the Egyptians. And so we've seen gnats come, we've seen water turn to blood, we've seen frogs, there was darkness, I think was the last one that just happened. Everything was dark except for where the Israelites lived. Isn't that interesting that God was protecting his people from these plagues? And so now Peter and Mary are in the house of Moses, and chapter 11 is called One More Plague. And we are going to dive in right now. Chapter 11, One More Plague. "Welcome to my home," said Moses. "This is my wife, Zipporah." "Pleased to meet you," said Peter. "You look familiar," said Moses. "Did I see you at Pharaoh's palace?" "Yes," said Peter. "It's a long story." "I love stories," said Zipporah. "Please tell us." Peter told them how they were rescued by Pharaoh's daughter out of the Nile River, how they lived in the palace like Egyptian royalty, how things started getting difficult with the plagues, how they were accused of being criminals and had to escape into the desert. "I know it sounds like a crazy story," said Peter, "but it's true." Moses smiled. "I believe you," he said. "We have a lot in common." "You must be exhausted," said Zipporah. "Please rest." Peter and Mary plopped down on the cushions. Hank curled up at Peter's feet. "You escaped the palace just in time," said Moses. "It's about to get even worse." Mary sat up straight. "How could things get worse?" "God is bringing one more plague," said Moses. "The Pharaoh will let Israel go." "What's going to happen?" said Mary. "At midnight, all of the firstborn sons in Egypt will die," said Moses. A chill ran through Peter's body. "I'm a firstborn son," he said. His eyes widened. "Am I going to die?" "No," said Moses. "You're safe here." "Are you sure?" said Peter. "Yes," said Moses. "Let me show you why you are safe." Peter, Mary, and Hank followed Moses outside. He pointed to a lamb lying dead on a small table. This lamb will protect you." "How is a dead lamb going to save my life?" Peter's heart pounded. Moses picked up a small bowl filled with blood from the lamb. "God told us to take blood from a perfect lamb and paint it on the top and side doorposts." The sun began to set. "It's time," said Moses. He picked up a small branch covered in leaves. He dipped it in the blood and marked the doorposts. "Are you sure that's enough?" said Peter. After all, his life was at stake. "Yes," said Moses. "This is exactly what God told me to do." Moses pointed at the dark sky. "Death will pass over or skip every house protected by the blood of the Lamb." Peter looked out and saw two young men coming down the road. They ran up and hugged Moses. "These are my sons, Gershom and Eleazar," said Moses. "Why did you want us to come?" asked Gershom. "It sounded important," said Eleazar. "The time has come," said Moses, "the time to be free." Peter was not interested in talking. He was worried about dying. "Which one of you is the oldest?" he said to Moses' sons. "I am," said Gershom. "Well, you better get inside," said Peter. He grabbed Gershom's arm and pulled him through the door. Moses carried the lamb and gave it to Zipporah. She started a fire in the brick oven and cooked the lamb. Later they ate the lamb and waited for death to pass over. A strong wind howled outside, but Hank didn't make a sound. Peter's heart thumped. "I hope this works." "Trust God," said Mary. "Easy for you to say," said Peter. "You're a girl. We should have solved the scroll earlier so we could be out of here." The rushing wind stopped. Peter looked out the window. It was calm. Then he heard shouts of joy coming from the houses of the Israelites. They were alive. Death had passed over them. Then Peter heard cries of sorrow from the Egyptian houses across the desert. Death did not pass over them. There was a knock at the door. It was the captain. "Pharaoh wants to see you," he said to Moses. He turned and walked away with his head lowered. "It's time to go," said Moses. Everyone followed Moses. As they left Goshen and headed to Pharaoh's palace, Peter looked back. There were Israelites as far as he could see. "There must be 1,000,000 people," said Mary. Pharaoh stood at the palace entrance. Peter could tell his heart was broken. "Get out of Egypt," said Pharaoh, "and take the rest of the Israelites with you." Joseph and his little sister ran out of the palace. "I'm free," he shouted. "I'm finally free." "Peter, Mary," shouted a girl's voice. "Wait!" Princess Shapharah caught up to them. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "My brother died," she said. Mary hugged her. "I am sorry." Princess Shapharah wiped tears from her eyes. "I must be brave," she said. "I will be queen someday." Peter looked ahead. The Israelites were leaving Egypt. "Before you go," she said, "I have gifts for you." She gave Mary a golden necklace with a brilliant blue amulet. She gave Hank a silver collar with a red ruby. "I'm sorry, but we have to go now," said Peter. "Wait, this is for you," said Princess Shapharah. She handed him a golden staff. It had a cobra's head with red ruby eyes. "Now go. I must comfort my people." A tear rolled down her cheek. "You will be a good queen," said Mary. "Goodbye, Queen Shapharah," said Peter. He bowed quickly and turned to leave. Peter, Mary, and Hank joined the Israelites as they left Egypt, free at last. They ran to the front to be closer to Moses. As they approached the desert, Peter saw a huge pillar of fire stretching into the night sky. The pillar of fire moved ahead of them. God was leading the way. They walked the rest of the night, and when the sun rose, the Israelites followed a pillar of cloud. They walked all day and again all night. Finally, the next day, they stopped at the Red Sea. Peter looked around. The sea was too deep and wide to cross, so the group set up camp and rested. Hank barked and ran out of the camp. Peter and Mary chased him. When Hank finally stopped, he growled at something in the distance. Peter looked through the binoculars. The great magician at midnight were standing on top of a sand dune. "This can't be good," said Peter. Chapter 12, The Final Battle. The great magician at midnight turned and disappeared behind the sand dune. "Let's see where they're going," said Peter. They climbed to the top and saw a chariot speeding away across the desert to Pharaoh's palace. "He just won't give up," said Peter. "Let's go," said Mary. Back at camp, Peter pulled out the journal and wrote, Day 13. I haven't written in a few days. Things have been pretty hectic, and now we only have 1 day left to solve the secret of the scroll. The Israelites are finally free. God showed Pharaoh how powerful he is, but I am a little worried about what the great magician has up his sleeve. Peter put the journal away and laid his head on the leather bag. He stared up at the glittering sky and drifted off to sleep. The sun rose and the Israelites prepared to keep going, but the pillar of cloud didn't move, so everyone waited. After a while, Peter felt the ground rumbling. It was barely noticeable at first. Mary, do you feel that? Yes, said Mary. I hope it's not another plague. The rumbling got stronger. I hope it's not an earthquake, said Peter. Peter walked to the edge of camp. Mary came up behind him and looked through the binoculars. She groaned. It's not an earthquake. She handed the binoculars to Peter. He looked out across the desert. Hundreds of chariots and soldiers were coming their way. The sun reflected off their suits of armor, and a cloud of sand came from the pounding hooves of the horses. Thousands of soldiers marched behind the chariots while Pharaoh led the charge. Peter turned the other way and saw the Red Sea. We're trapped! They ran back to the Israelite camp. Everyone was panicking, except for Moses. He climbed up the side of the desert mountain and to talk to the people. Did you lead us into the desert just to die? Shouted one man. I wish we had stayed in Egypt as slaves, a woman wailed. Moses quieted the crowd and said, Don't be afraid. Stand still and watch God rescue you today. The Israelites looked across the desert and saw the Egyptian army marching closer. This will be the last time you see the Egyptians, said Moses. God will fight for you. The pillar of cloud moved between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. Halt! Shouted the captain. The army did not pass the pillar. The Israelites stood their ground. As the sun set, Moses held up his arms and stretched his staff over the Red Sea. God made a strong wind blow from the east. It blew harder and harder until it made the water split right down the middle. The wind kept blowing. It held the tall walls of water in place. The Israelites walked across the dry ground in the middle. Peter, Mary, and Hank followed them into the bed of the Red Sea. The walls of water stood high above their heads. As Peter walked, he saw a school of fish swim by. This reminds me of the aquarium, said Peter. He stuck his hand into the water. Get your hand out, said Mary. You don't know what's in there. Just then, a shark swam by. Peter stumbled back and rolled across the ground. Hank growled at the shark, and it swam away. Peter brushed himself off and picked up his bag and the golden staff. Let's catch up with the Israelites, said Mary. They're almost across. They jogged to the edge of the Red Sea and finally crossed down to the shore. Mary said, Let's look at the scroll again. We have to solve it before the sun rises, or we'll be stuck here. Peter reached down to pull out the scroll. His heart raced. The bag was unzipped. He searched the bag. It's gone. Where is it? Said Mary. I don't know, said Peter. It must have fallen out when I dropped the bag. They hurried back into the Red Sea to look for it. There it is, said Peter. It was on the sea floor, not far away. Peter felt the ground rumbling. He looked up and saw the great magician riding a chariot toward the scroll. Peter sprinted toward it, but the horse was too fast. The great magician leaned out of the chariot and scooped up the scroll. Looking for this, he said with an evil grin. Give it back, shouted Peter. The scroll is mine, shouted the great magician. Have fun fighting the Egyptian army. The chariot began to speed away. Just then, Peter saw a glowing ball in the water. It grew bigger and burst through the wall of water. It flew onto the chariot and knocked the wheels off. The ball of light became Michael. He drew his flaming sword and knocked the great magician out of the chariot. The scroll flew out of his hand. Mary ran to pick it up, but Midnight leaped in front of her and roared. She backed away. Michael charged into the panther and sent him rolling into the sea. The great magician picked up the scroll. Peter swung his golden staff like a baseball bat and hit the scroll out of his hand. Hank, fetch! Hank caught the scroll mid-air and brought it back to Peter. The great magician huffed. You can have your precious scroll for now. I don't need it. You are about to see the power of the Egyptian army, he snarled. The Israelites will be destroyed. No, you're about to see the power of God, said Peter. He will set them free. The scroll shook in Peter's hand, and Mary ran to his side. He unrolled it and saw the last hieroglyphics glow and transform into the words set and free. The wind stopped blowing and the walls of water became crashing waves. The waves swallowed the Egyptian army, and they were rushing toward the great magician, Peter, Mary, and Hank. The great magician made one last attempt to grab the scroll. As the sea swirled around them, Peter held up the scroll and read, "God is powerful and will set you free." Then the water was gone. Peter, Mary, and Hank stood safe and dry in Great Uncle Solomon's library. The red wax seal transformed into a gold medallion inscribed with a pyramid. "That was way too close," said Peter. Great Uncle Solomon rushed into the library. "Welcome back," he said. "You three look like Egyptian royalty." He laughed. "I like your skirt, Peter." "It's not a skirt," said Peter. "We had an amazing adventure," said Mary. She told Great Uncle Solomon about the pyramids and the palace and the Great Sphinx. "It sounds exciting," said Great Uncle Solomon. "It wasn't all fun," said Peter. He told him about the frogs and flies and the hailstorm. He told him how the great magician tried to take the scroll. Peter also told Great Uncle Solomon about the lambs that were sacrificed to save his life and the lives of the other firstborn sons. He ended his story. "God showed us his power and set the Israelites free." Great Uncle Solomon grabbed his big red Bible from a bookshelf. "Let me tell you the rest of the story." He told them how God led the Israelites through the desert for 40 years. He told them God protected the Israelites and gave them all of the food and water they needed. Then he told them how the people stopped trusting God and started complaining about everything. Because of this, most of them never got to go into the Promised Land. "What's the Promised Land?" said Peter. "That's a story for another day," said Great Uncle Solomon. He also told them how God would send another sacrifice that was better than the lamb, a sacrifice that would save the world. "I can't wait to find out what happens," said Mary. Peter smiled and wondered where the scrolls would take them next. The end of book 3. If you're interested in reading book 4, let me know, or go ahead and look for it on your own. Book 4, sorry, I was just looking for it. Book 4 is Journey to Jericho, and it is about the Israelites entering the Promised Land. And so you can sure look that up and read it. Hey, listen, if you got a book from me, I would appreciate it if you would return it on Sunday. If you would like to keep your copy of the book, I would really appreciate it if your parents would donate $5 for that book, because that will help us to be able to keep doing fun things like this. And this Sunday, we're going to continue our series on Ruth. I'm very excited to see you on Sunday. Bye, you guys.